Merci beaucoup pour cette opportunité de venir ici et de parler avec vous. And the rest of this will be in English. I want to talk about Ethiopia, and that's a country that actually has enjoyed a lot of success in the last couple of decades, and I believe has laid a foundation for substantial further growth and poverty reduction. So I'm going to talk about some big changes that have been happening in Ethiopia largely because of public investments in infrastructure, and we'll talk about some key policies. And then I want to present some analysis of implications of the allocation of public investments. So in Ethiopia, you can see from this graph that bottom green shaded area is agricultural GDP, and you can see it's grown rapidly over the last decade. The light blue is the service sector. That's the other sector that's expanded. And that black line on the top shows the share of agriculture in GDP. Generally, as countries develop over time, you see the share of agriculture in overall output start to fall, and you're starting to see that in Ethiopia. It fell from about 50% in the year 2000, and it's down to around 42% now. But the industrial sector remains very small in Ethiopia. The large and medium-scale manufacturing is about 2.7% of GDP. It's been growing rapidly, about 8% per year. And again, agriculture has also grown rapidly, around 7% a year. Next slide. But one of the big changes that's happening in Ethiopia is rapid urbanization. If you look at official estimates of urbanization, and those are based on administrative definitions of urban areas, and that includes villages as small as 5,000 people are considered urban. And if you look at that definition, urbanization has increased from 11% in 1984 to about 16% in 2007. If we use another definition of agglomeration, areas close to cities of 50,000 people or more, you get a very low rate of urbanization in 1984, less than 4%, but rapidly increasing to 14% in 2007. And that means, if you look at that definition, urban population is growing at close to 9% a year. Next slide. And you can see, just in this figure, the blue line at the bottom shows that urbanization, number of urban population, according to that 50,000 population size cutoff for urban areas, that urban center plus the people that are within 1 hour travel time to that urban center. Next slide. And so what's happened in Ethiopia? You've had big investments in infrastructure, in roads, and you've had some increases in the population in these urban centers. So back in 1984, this map is showing you the travel time to a center of 50,000 people or more, and the green, dark green, shows areas that are more than 10 hours away travel time to get to a city of 50,000 or more. Next slide. By 1994 and then 2007, you see massive investments in infrastructure, and that means more and more rural areas and farmers are connected to viable markets for their products. Another way of looking at this is how many millions of people are part of these urban agglomerations, 50,000 people or more. And you can see 1984, we're at around 6 million people. Today, around 38 million people. That's not just growing size of cities, it's also that connectivity that we've shown in the preceding map. Go ahead. Another massive change happening, electricity generation. And you can see at the end of this, at the far right end of the figure, in the last 5 years, the electricity generation capacity has almost tripled in Ethiopia, and there's a lot more expected online within the next 10 years. Almost all of this is hydroelectric power. And in fact, we expect that within 10 years, Ethiopia's biggest export is likely to be electricity. Next slide. The other thing that's happening in Ethiopia, as well as across sub-Saharan Africa, is connectivity in terms of telecommunications. And so if you look in 2003, you have less than 500,000 people who are connected to a landline, or there were essentially no mobile phones at that point. And now we're approaching 10 million people with the mobile phones and another over 4 million with the landline. There's been a tremendous increase in connectivity in telecommunications. And then there was some mention earlier, this is not all about bricks, mortar, roads, communications, cell phones. It's about people in terms of successful development. And you can see net primary school enrollment between 91 and 2007 in Ethiopia rising from about 22% to over 70%. And happily, that's also, we've also seen a significant increase in the enrollment of girls as well. And so there's evidence of all these investments having some effects on poverty, and you can see that the poverty rate has declined from about 46% to about 38%. That last year is 2005. There hasn't been a national household survey since 2005. There's one in the field now, and one would expect, given these kinds of investments, this kind of growth, that poverty will have continued to decline. But Ethiopia then faces big development choices in terms of strategy as it moves on. It has invested heavily in agricultural development-led industrialization. Big investments in the agricultural sector. And now there's a question of how much does one continue to invest in agriculture to promote rural non-farm, rural employment, rural incomes, or does a much greater share of investment need to be in urban areas so that you have bigger markets and more rapid GDP growth? You can see that many countries talk about investing in agriculture, and Ethiopia actually did it. So if you look at the graph, first part is in the year 2000, and at that point, the total investment in the country was about 10 billion. This is public investment in the development budget. It tripled over the decade, and you can see that a huge share of this is in the rural areas. We made these calculations. We made estimates of investments not just in agriculture, but rural roads and so forth. Next slide. Another big issue is also what should be done in terms of promoting migration or in promoting land markets. In Ethiopia, it's generally prohibited to sell land, and if you leave the rural areas, you often lose your land rights. That's a major disincentive for rural to urban migration. Likewise, coming into an urban area, there are often registration requirements. So rural-urban migration has not been encouraged in the country. So we did some modeling analysis with the Ethiopian Development Research Institute to look at the effects of public investments. And we looked at what's the implication of shifting investments from where they are today to greater share invested in cities or in small towns or in rural areas, all holding the total level of public investment constant. Next slide. And what we find, if you look at the top, we find that rural-focused investment results in slower overall GDP growth. And of course, urban investment, by investing in that infrastructure in the cities, it favors industry. Conversely, of course, if you invest in rural areas in increasing agricultural productivity, you increase rural growth. Next slide. But what's really important here is that there's a trade-off. And that is, given that Ethiopia still has a substantial amount of people in the rural areas that are poor, investing in agriculture results in a greater rate of poverty reduction than does urban investment, even though urban investment gives us higher GDP growth. Next slide. And so what we see is accelerated urbanization increases economic growth. To some extent, it improves rural welfare, and it can reduce the rural-urban divide. But that urbanization requires supporting public investment. In other words, if you're going to have that greater urbanization, it would require providing the public capital, the public services, to avoid simply creating slums. Next slide. And so urbanization and industrialization are a crucial part of development and accelerating growth. But our analysis is suggesting that given the low levels of GDP per capita in Ethiopia, and given a high concentration of poverty in rural areas, and then most importantly, the fact that there is a realistic prospect of increasing agricultural productivity in the country, the analysis is suggesting that Ethiopia and other poor countries in sub-Saharan Africa should not neglect agriculture in their development strategies. Next slide. And I just wanted to conclude with a little slide on the importance of capacity building, policy, and policy analysis. And the top left slide is your standard slide. You've seen it 100 times. Everybody's smiling after a course. Right below that, though, is a very important slide, and I want to call attention to the Ethiopian gentleman standing there. He's not the professor, he's the student. He's got a PhD in economics from Oxford, but he bothered to go to the course, and that was a great encouragement to everybody else. Because often old guys like me are embarrassed to admit that we don't know everything. But this guy did that. And then moving one to the right, a little ceremony for the training that was done on the kind of modeling that I presented here. And just that Atta Noai, a chief economic advisor to the Prime Minister, head of the Research Institute, bothered to support the policy analytical capacity by participating in the ceremony. And then finally, upper right, some of the students of those courses that ultimately wrote their own papers to do economic analysis about development policy choices in Ethiopia. So the point is that these policies are important and that we need to invest in capacity in country for this kind of analysis. Merci beaucoup.